Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Tim Canova and Kelley Lane are here with us today to talk about elections and election integrity. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. In our discussion today, Tim Canova, Kelley Lane, and I talk about Tim Canova's experience running in the Democratic primary against Debbie Wasserman-Schultz in Florida's 23rd District in 2016, and running again in the general election as an independent in 2018. We also talk about election integrity issues and the upcoming 2020 presidential election. Tim Canova is an activist, politician, and law professor, specializing in banking and finance. Since 2012, he's been a professor of law and public finance at Nova Southeastern University. He's the chairman of Progress for All, a small donor-based grassroots political and community action group supporting progressive candidates and causes at the national, state, and local levels. Kelley Lane is an independent journalist and an activist. She's a board member at Candidates with a Contract, CWAC, and the editor and producer of the Assange Countdown to Freedom show, and also a volunteer with AuditUSA. We recorded this on October 19th, 2020. Tim Canova and Kelley Lane are here with us tonight. This is a special edition of Around the Empire, election edition, if you will, or pre-election edition. And I'm really glad to have both of you. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Tim, if you would just tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am a law professor at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And in 2016, I jumped into politics, you could say, by challenging my local congresswoman in a Democratic primary. And that congresswoman is Debbie Wasserman-Schultz. And at the time, she was the chair of the Democratic National Committee.
Yeah, at an interesting time, too.
Yeah.
Kelley, could you do the same? Just tell everybody, introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Kelley Lane. I'm an independent journalist and activist. I've kind of dabbled in a lot of different things, really jumping in when Bernie ran in 2016. I was glued to everything that was going on in that primary with the election. Funny business, we'll call it. And then I joined CFAR and then CWAC, Candidates with a Contract. And I'm on the board of Candidates with a Contract still. And we seek to, help independent candidates, or at least independent-minded candidates, sort of get the word out about why they're running. And I've also volunteered with Movement for a People's Party and several election integrity activist groups. So
great, thanks.
So tonight, Assange Countdown to Freedom. Also, I've been working on that show behind the scenes. So.
Yeah, I mean, aren't you the editor and producer of that?
Yep, I've been doing that since April.
Right. And also at an interesting time, because Randy has, been in the limelight a lot in recent months and years. So yeah. It's got to be fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
So tonight we're going to talk about three things. I said it was an election edition, but not just this election. First, we're going to ask Tim to talk to us about his experience running as a candidate in a primary and in a congressional election, because it's a story I think that as many people as possible need to hear. And he's also just, and got the insider's view of it now. Same with Kelley, who has been in and around those elections and with an increasing sort of depth over the years. And we're also going to talk about the 2020 election, our thoughts on that. And then we're going to steer, and this is probably going to be threaded throughout the whole discussion, but kind of the thing that ties all this together is the subject of election integrity, because that's something all three of us are very concerned about. I think that's
A lot of people are concerned about it. And, you know, frankly, we have people telling us in the media and different officials telling us every day that there's our elections are a threat, our democracy is a threat. The Russians are trying to steal or mess with our elections and choose their candidates. And then, I mean, it even goes as far as think tanks and other organizations doing simulations for election chaos. They've been preparing us, it seems, for just some kind of very difficult election coming up. And I'm curious for people's thoughts on that. But not just that, we have, you know, more concrete information from these two people, and there are other people too, about things that have happened. So I think, I hope we can fit all this into an hour. That's all I've got to say. So Tim, if you would, I know that you're very well known and a lot of people have heard your story, but if you would sort of summarize it for us again and choose whatever highlights you think are most, you know, if you want to highlight one thing or another or not, if you don't have enough time for the whole thing, pull out the things that you think are most relevant right now.
Well, the experience we had in South Florida was quite eye-opening, not just for myself, but for many folks. We raised an awful lot of money in 2016 in small donations online, broke all kinds of records for highest percentage of small donations online. We raised almost $4 million from over 200,000 individual donations. And I resisted, you could say, some of the Bernie Sanders political consultants who wanted me to spend a lot more money on political consultants and on television ads. And we opened up 4 field offices in my 1 congressional district. And we were employing hundreds of folks, either in paid full-time jobs or part-time jobs or volunteers, knocking on doors. And 4 field offices in 1 district is quite a commitment to a grassroots ground game. And we were knocking on 12,000 doors a week in the heat of the summer of 2016 for an August 30th primary.
Can you just tell everybody exactly where that is in Florida? Sorry to interrupt.
Sure. It's most of it is in Broward County, the southern part of Broward County, just south of Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood, Pembroke Pines, Weston, Plantation, Davie, and a sliver of northern Miami-Dade, Aventura, and a little bit of the beach communities coming up in the north, like I said, northern part of Miami-Dade. And we were knocking on 12,000 doors a week. Our final field numbers showed us crushing Wasserman-Schultz, and that was our experience on the ground for the 10 days of early voting and on election day. And, you know, you could, I suppose, focus on public opinion polls, but those public opinion polls that were done in that race were done a couple of months before the election, really as our surge was beginning. We weren't far behind in those opinion polls, but those opinion polls were based on polling, I think, 600 voters. When we were knocking on 12,000 doors a week, that was quite a lot of field data that was being input into the minivan voter database. And again, it showed us running away with it. And so when election night occurred, well, I should say the night before the election, the local NBC affiliate on their website previewed the upcoming day's elections. And all the races were zeroed out because no votes had been counted yet, like for sheriff and county commissioner races and stuff like that. But for my race, it had Wasserman-Schultz defeating me by something like 14 percentage points with 69% of the precincts counted. And we called up NBC6 right away, asked for an explanation. They took it down from their website, but they never gave an explanation. And there's a lot of coordination between the Broward Supervisor of Elections and the local television affiliates prepping for the next day's broadcast of results. So we don't know what happened. Anyway, the polls closed on election night. They said Wasserman-Schultz won by 13 percentage points. I never conceded defeat, and instead I asked to see the paper ballots. Here in South Florida, the system that's used is everyone votes on a paper ballot. The paper ballots are not counted by hand. They're run through an electronic tabulation scanning machine that's made by ES&S, Election System and Software, one of the three giant firms that dominate the electronic voting machines of this country. And we asked to see the paper ballots. We have statutory rights in Florida under the public records laws. Even the Florida Constitution grants citizens rights to inspect records. And it was well established that ballots are public records. Nonetheless, the supervisor of elections, Brenda Snipes at the time, jerked us around for 6 or 7 months. I finally filed a lawsuit to enforce my inspection rights. 3 months into the lawsuit, after they were resisting and throwing up as many procedural roadblocks as they could, we served discovery requests. And of course, the discovery requests were let us see the paper ballots. And 3 days later, on September 1st, 2017, Brenda Snipes ordered the destruction of every ballot that was cast in Broward County on August 30th, 2016 in my primary, and they were destroyed right away. And still, Snipes did not admit to that destruction for more than 2.5 months, did not tell the court, did not tell me or my lawyers. And even when she did tell the court, they would not concede anything. The litigation continued, which in a way was very good that it did, because we took Brenda Snipes' sworn videotaped deposition in which she admitted to destroying all the ballots and having no excuse. The judge, this was the Florida 17th Judicial Circuit, he granted us summary judgment, which really opened us up just to getting attorney's fees, nothing else, since the ballots were gone. But he wrote a 10-page decision which listed out really all of the statutory violations of Brenda Snipes in destroying these ballots under state and federal law with criminal sanctions under these statutes. She's obligated to maintain these public records for 22 months, and she missed by a full 10 months. These are punishable by up to 5 years in prison as felonies. And we were hopeful when the judge's order came out that it would open the floodgates and that we'd get a criminal investigation and prosecution. That never happened. In some ways, that was the most troubling aspect of this, to have a smoking gun, to have a court ruling. And the Republican governor, Rick Scott, was unwilling to remove Brenda Snipes, unwilling to push a criminal investigation. My lawyer engaged with the acting U.S. Attorney, Benjamin Greenberg, at the time for something like 90 minutes. Greenberg seemed very excited about prosecuting. After all, we were handing a case on a silver platter. And unfortunately, Greenberg then went up to Washington, D.C. for a week of meetings at the Justice Department with Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General. And he came back and there was no criminal prosecution in the offing after that, and there never has been one. It's a 4-year statute of limitations. Snipes could be prosecuted up till September 1st, 2017. Instead, she was allowed to retire with a $130,000 a year pension, and there's been no investigation as to who she was working with. I should mention that Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, according to Snipes' own lawyer, Wasserman-Schultz was willing to sign an affidavit to the court to try to prevent the lawsuit.
So, Tim, do you want to go into a little bit of some of the people who helped investigate what was going on in that election? I've got a graph here. I don't know if it would be too difficult to do a share screen, but it's from Lulu Freistad's blog. But it's a graph that Phil Evans, a statistician, had done, showing basically the 5%. It's like a clear mathematical, I mean, you can see it. It's like 5% more to Wasserman-Schultz, and it's just it had to be a computer to do that.
Lulu Freistad, an award-winning journalist from New York, first contacted me in the days after our August 30th, 2016 primary. And I was being contacted by a number of election watchers and election integrity experts from around the country. And Lulu prevailed upon me to take a look at the work that her research team was doing. And I believe that included Phil Evans. They were doing what's called a cumulative voter tally, in which they count up the votes by precinct from smallest to largest precinct. And it's really based on the mathematical law of large numbers. And that's what polling is based on. It's computational science, that the more votes that you count, the more likely each vote will look like the thousands that have been counted before it. So there might be a lot of variation in the vote count in the first precinct that you count. If it's a precinct of 100 votes, I could be ahead by, 30 percentage points. It doesn't mean much. But after you've counted 100 precincts and you've got, tens of thousands of votes counted, they're all going to start looking a lot like the votes that have already been counted. So you get a lot of variation early, and then the lines even out, and you end up with two parallel horizontal lines across the screen. And when you looked at their cumulative voter tally in our race, it showed me ahead by, I think, about 10 or 12 points. And it looked like I was, I had been pulling ahead, and then it looked like it was the variation was about to even out. And it looked like I was poised to keep that tally across the page and win by 10 to 15 points. When suddenly there's a flip in the vote, it never gets horizontal. Instead, the two lines diverge at a mathematically precise angle, as if there's been a computer algorithm that is given for every Wasserman-Schultz vote, 1.3 votes. For every Canova vote, point, whatever. I don't know what the actual algorithm was, but this is what was brought to my attention. And I was concerned enough. And there was, I must say, a crescendo beginning to happen of people who were convinced Wasserman-Schultz had rigged this. And I thought, look, the fastest, easiest way to put this to rest and to get some certainty is to verify the vote, is just to inspect the ballots. There are 200 precincts. Let's start with a dozen of the key precincts, the big precincts. If we go through those ballots in our public records request and they pretty much match up to the official tally, then there's nothing there. But we didn't get that opportunity. They destroyed all the ballots instead.
So I'm just going to share screen really quickly and show this.
When you look at the very left-hand side of the screen, you can see I'm ahead by a bit, but there's volatility. And then suddenly there's a flip in the vote, and there's volatility, but it does look like there's some kind of mathematical algorithm going on there.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Benny Smith talks a lot about that at Fraction Magic, about how these programs could be put in place to
Benny Smith and Bev Harris. That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They do great work.
Which would be a pretty simple algorithm. I'm surprised that they wouldn't make it a little bit more complicated and have it jump around a little bit.
I'm told that all it would take is about 5 lines of source code, manipulating 5 lines of source code software, but we're not allowed to inspect the software.
I know.
Because
that's the crazy thing.
Yeah.
That's what's so shocking when I learned that it's proprietary software. So the very, core of our democracy, voting, that's like private information owned by private companies, and the public isn't allowed to inspect.
It's really nuts. It's really nuts.
Yeah, and I don't think most people realize that, or hopefully more are becoming aware. But
these electronic tabulation machines in South Florida and all over Florida, they've got wireless cellular modems on them. Mm-hmm. John Brakey discovered that in 2018 when I ran as an independent.
Didn't they swear they didn't?
Yes.
Yeah, they had sworn they didn't, and it turns out they did. They do have wireless cellular modems on them. In 2018, when we ran, we had a volunteer at one of the election precincts on election night who, on her cell phone camera, took video of a line of cars offloading ballots from blue satchels onto a rented truck. So there was no chain of custody and I've been told since then that the actual sheriff had instructed his deputies to stand down. So there was no sheriff deputies to sign receipts for these ballots. There's no chain of custody in those paper ballots. There's no chain of custody in the electronic voting machines in light of those wireless cellular modems on them.
Well, I was at that precinct where the wireless modems were discovered, and we were outside after they closed, and they were short-staffed. And so someone was transporting the ballots in her car, and she said to us, to John Brakey and I, that there was supposed to be someone from each party like present to transport the ballots, but they didn't have someone else, so she was doing it. So, I mean, that doesn't say that, yes, it was definitely, something was fraud was going on, but the fact is that it easily could have been. There's no, security in that there.
In 2018, I ran as an independent when no Democrat responded at all to the ballot destruction. And I contacted just about, I think, every major Democratic elected official in Florida. And we sent letters to every member of the House and Senate of both parties. And there was just no investigation whatsoever into the ballot destruction. So I ran as an independent, and a few weeks before our November 2018 general election against Wasserman-Schultz and a Republican in a district that's heavily gerrymandered. It's about 45% Democrat, 35% independent, and something like 25% Republican. Just a few weeks before, a Republican news outlet published a report that there was a Republican poll stating what we had heard through the grapevine, because there hadn't been any polls released, which was that Wasserman-Schultz had a low ceiling. Her unfavorability ratings were so high that she couldn't break out of the mid-30s. And they had Wasserman-Schultz and me in a dead heat at 34% each, the Republican in the teens, and about 20% undecided. And it was much harder to know. We had a smaller field operation, but still pretty significant. And we thought we were going to be right there neck and neck. It was hard to tell, how it would come out. But the polls closed. We had that evidence of, ballots being thrown onto trucks, rented trucks. And an hour after the polls closed, they declared Wasserman-Schultz the victor. She was suddenly the most popular politician in the entire state of Florida. And I had 5% of the vote, which was ludicrous, we thought. But as the statisticians really, and again, Lulu Freistedt took the lead, as those research teams analyzed the numbers, they noticed something very glaring, which was that I didn't just get 5% of the total vote. I got 5% of every demographic group: whites, blacks, Hispanics, males, females, Republicans, Democrats, independents, and 5% in every precinct, regardless of size. The Dr. David Bader, the chair of, I think, New Jersey Institute of Technology and a highly credentialed expert in computational science, took a look at the numbers, and he said it was as unlikely a result as winning the lottery every day for a year. So, the Democrats love to talk about science when it comes to climate change and things, but apparently computational science doesn't much matter to them. We filed a formal challenge in the House of Representatives with the House Administration Committee, and they have never so much as acknowledged receiving our complaint.
So Tim, that happened in the 2018 election when you ran in the general as an independent?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, plus independents it's very hard to run as an independent in this country.
Well, especially if they're rigging voting machines against Greens
and
Libertarians to make sure they don't get over 3% of the vote.
I just want to add a little bit of detail to because there are a lot of people listening who, aren't political junkies, let's say, maybe not even in this country. There's a good chance there's a lot of people who don't live here. But the 2016 election, the whole world was pretty much watching that election. And you have to remember that the time that Tim ran as a Democrat in a primary against Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, she is, of course, it was during a period when she was infamous. She was getting a lot of headlines. If you remember at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, I think it was like the day before a convention started, the WikiLeaks dump started coming out, and it showed that the DNC definitely did rig the primary against Bernie, and everyone came to that realization at the same time. And the dedicated Democrats, the delegates and such, were all assembled in one room, and she got there's footage out there, you may have seen it. There was just like almost a riot against her in that room, and they had to sort of quickly get her out of that position, they had to shove Donna Brazile into there as a temporary DNC chairwoman. And, you know, even if the press was very biased toward Hillary, which in general they were, they couldn't ignore this story. This was all over the place. She was, and I could imagine there were plenty of other local reasons. You know, everybody's got an opinion about their own congressperson. Well, maybe some people don't even know who they are, but, you know, she has a long history. There's no politician who has been in office in one place for a long time that doesn't have, you know,
well,
baggage.
Joanne, I must say that the local issues were fantastic. I mean, it was like a free fire zone in that campaign. Wasserman-Schultz had, and I think a large part of the reason was she had taken millions of dollars from just about every corporate interest you could imagine, and then sided with them on the issues. So she was with Big Pharma. She was for the war on drugs. We had a medical marijuana referendum on the ballot that day, and she was against it. I was for medical marijuana. She had taken money from one of the largest private prison companies in the world, and then pushed publicly for their project, their proposed private immigration detention center in Southwest Ranches in our district. It was just one issue after another. And then, yes, on top of that, in a Democratic primary, you know, she had made herself incredibly unpopular for how she had treated Bernie Sanders. And I remember early in my campaign, the few political advisors I had were telling me I was going to have a problem during the summer because Wasserman-Schultz would be getting a lot of free airtime at the Democratic convention. And this was 6 months before the convention. And I said, just tell me, how does she not get booed off of the big stage at the convention? Well, she didn't get booed off the big stage. She got booed off the small stage the day before the convention even started.
Yeah, if she had gotten booed off the stage at the big stage, I won't go into all the details, but they had all kinds of mechanisms to mute that kind of thing so that, you know, the Bernie supporters in general couldn't be heard. They broke through a lot of times, like No More War with that general that Hillary put up there. But yeah, so this was, I've had forgotten about those issues. I mean, you can't follow every race, but I was watching yours, and she was extremely unpopular person.
Totally.
So I'd kind of like to get into an issue that I deal with, and that is that the majority of the election security, election integrity activist community is very much any blue will do. And as a very strong independent, I happen to be leftist. I've never voted Republican, but I am very concerned about what I see all the time in the bias. And I think it's hurting efforts to really have real election integrity. I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, Tim. But from my perspective, I wasn't really paying a lot of attention to this issue until Bernie ran in the primary. So that's where I think some of us, later comers to this effort, that's where we came in. We witnessed the Democrats, rigging a primary against the candidate that we wanted, right? And so I'll never forget, I was at Unrig the System in New Orleans, February 2018, I believe. And I was there, I wanted to go to all the election integrity panels and everything. And I was shocked to learn that so many of the people that had been in this work for a long time didn't know anything about what had happened in the primary.
How is that possible? How is that possible?
I sat down with this one guy, and I honestly can't remember the organization's name right now, but and I don't know if I would want to call him out publicly anyway, but I said something about all the voters booted off the rolls in Brooklyn, and he just looked at me blankly like he'd never heard of this. And I said, have you heard about Tim Canova's race? And I started going through all the different, the examples that I watched. And that was really when I became very disillusioned with the media, and shortly thereafter cut my cable. But I thought, all this stuff is happening. Surely this is going to be on the news, and none of it was. And that was when I started really seeing like how much CNN and MSNBC was basically PR for the Clinton campaign, and they were not covering Bernie, and they were not covering all of these things that were happening to suppress people's votes. So my experience, I think most of the people that they do a lot of good work. They've been at it for some of them 20 years, but I think that they just came in at a time, a lot of them joined the efforts in 2000 or 2004. So they started, when it was Bush v. Gore and the fiasco in Ohio in 2004. So that's their perspective, but they seem to have this blind spot that the Democrats are the good guys, and that I just was blown away. And there were others I won't name by name, but were absolutely clueless about the stuff that had happened in the 2016 primary. So I think that's ultimately the problem, that they just kind of have, it's the lens that they're looking at it through. Whereas the lens that I was looking through was, with working with candidates with a contract, it was largely progressive candidates. We only had like 2 Republicans, and I would say they were more like kind of libertarian type. But we had Democrats, independents, and Greens, but they were up against the Democratic Party first. And so that was just the lens that I was looking at everything in. But I don't know what we do with that a lot of them think they're being nonpartisan, but they're not. And it's really difficult to watch. So I don't know how much you want to get into that, Tim. I'm sure you have a lot to say about that.
I've had the same experience in many ways. I was on a number of listservs with election integrity activists. I certainly found that they seem very biased, assuming that the Democrats never rig elections and it's always the Republicans rigging. I'm a living reminder that Democrats do rig elections. They do it in their primaries, whether they do it in the general election or not. I'm convinced they do it in any election. I'm not saying Republicans don't rig, but these election integrity activists, so-called experts, would certainly cast a blind eye towards the Democrats and their riggings. And I started to ask them quite clearly to please disclose where they were getting their grant money from. And not a single one of them would release that kind of information. There was no transparency at a time when, they complain that the president of the United States hasn't released his taxes, and, but no, it's none of my business or anyone's business where the election integrity experts are getting their funding from. And there's lots of speculation that comes from Microsoft itself. So there are vested interests that are involved in keeping these experts on the Democratic Party's plantation.
So we could talk about Election Guard, if you know much about that.
I've learned more about it from you, Kelly, actually. You're more of an expert on Election Guard than I am.
Well, I started, it was the article that I found, Whitney Webb from Mint Press wrote about it, and just basically how, by making it the voting machines, part of critical infrastructure, that this can be done across the board. There can be that source code that you said, mentioned, put in to put an algorithm in and rig something. And so, again, I don't want to get into naming names, but there are people that I recognize as part of companies that are involved with that in some of the meetings. And, I don't know.
Can I interrupt for a second? Mm-hmm. Just to clarify, so in the election integrity groups, which are, supposed to be grassroots type activist groups, you're seeing representatives from that are involved in the Election Guard product?
I have, yes.
I just wanted to make sure I understood
one in particular. And, that's not to say that he's doing anything nefarious. I don't know if people, it's kind of hard to tell whether someone is wittingly or unwittingly part of it, I think they honestly do believe that they're doing the right thing, but it's it's very partisan, and I don't know what we do to fix that, because
I'm convinced that we should only be counting our ballots by hand in public.
Yeah, me too.
We're the only major country that calls itself a democracy that has not banned the electronic voting machines. I think they've got a more reliable vote counting system in Afghanistan or Egypt, where they dip their thumbs in ink at this point, than what we've got. But like I said, every major country that calls itself a democracy counts their ballots by hand in public. And when I would bring that up with these election integrity folks, some would actually admit, yes, that's true. That would be the best way to do it, but it's not realistic. So they seem to have a vested interest in going along with the electronic voting machines. And whether it's a cognitive bias or they've been actually captured or corrupted by grants from the electronic voting machine industry, I don't really know. But those are the kind of reforms that are needed to make the system transparent and verifiable and trustworthy. In 2016, 97 million Americans who could have been registered and voted did not vote. And 60-some million voted for Trump and 60-some million voted for Hillary Clinton. So a plurality did not vote. Most Americans have just simply lost any kind of trust in the system at this point. And to restore that trust, the best way to do it is to have hand counting of paper ballots in public.
I totally agree with that. And I'm almost ashamed to admit that I think I'm going to join their ranks this time for the first time and not vote in a presidential election, because I don't want to prop it up as anything legitimate. I don't think it will be. But as far as it being plausible or scalable, whatever, possible, I might have bought that argument until I watched the Brexit vote. And, that was very public, televised, and a lot of people are watching it. I think there's 70 million people in the UK or something like that. So that shows that it is scalable. That's a big enough number, right? But what they did, they just had big, meeting halls or gymnasiums or something. And they had cafeteria tables, big long cafeteria tables, lots of people. And they had a stage, and they were counting the votes. And then someone would go and stand up on the stage, and the BBC and all the other news would broadcast them counting out the number. Now, of course, this is a simple election, right? It was like a yes or no referendum. So there's that. I'm not being unrealistic either, but our elections aren't that complicated, particularly when there aren't a million parties. So when I saw that in real time, and then I think they got their answer that night. It might have been in the middle of the night, but so what?
It was around midnight.
Yeah. So,
there is another alternative, I think. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Joanne.
No, I was finishing. Yeah.
So, I think there could be another alternative. There's an IT security expert guy that I know that basically designed a system that he says any of these voting machine companies could build this to specs of what he's come up with, and it's verifiable, and we can implement that. It would be maybe we could link I could put the link under on YouTube or something to his system. So I think there is a way to do it partly electronic, but it would have to be where it's still verifiable and uniform across, so things can be counted, and there can be an audit if necessary. But it's kind of complex, so I'm not going to try to explain it here, but we'll post the link.
I've heard proposals for blockchain voting. I don't know enough about that to feel comfortable with it. The argument that we have too many ballots to count, well, it's like a jury pool. The more ballots you have to count, the larger the population to draw upon for people to actually count votes, to count ballots. And one example of where it's worked pretty well is in Columbia County, New York, just 2 or 3 hours, I think, north of New York City, where they have two election commissioners, one Democrat and one Republican. And for some years, Dr. Virginia Martin was the Democratic election commissioner. And the tradition they had was they were forced, I should say, to count the ballots by machine under New York law, by electronic voting machine. But they would follow that up with a hand count of the paper ballots, which would usually take them 2 or 3 days, I think. And they would count every single paper ballot. And it became a good check. Nobody's going to want to rig the voting machines if it's going to be followed up shortly afterwards by a hand counting of paper ballots. Now, people will say, well, Columbia County is such a small county, it's not that many votes to count. But again, that means it's fewer citizens to draw upon as well to count those votes. So it worked there very well. There's a fellow running, I think, in Florida's 6th congressional district, Clint Curtis. And Clint's a very interesting fellow. Back in, I think, around 2000, he was a computer software programmer who was the company he worked for was asked by Tom Feeney, the Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives and a Republican speaker, if they could design a software program that would flip the votes, that would change the election outcome. And Clint Curtis threw himself into doing just that, naively thinking that what Feeney wanted to do was to expose the inherent vulnerability in the electronic voting systems. And to his horror, that's not what happened at all. And he became convinced that Feeney was using it to rig actual election results. And he blew the whistle. If folks could go online, I think even YouTube, I think, still has Clint Curtis's testimony to the House of Representatives in 2004. And Clint is running as a Democrat, and I don't agree with him on his whole agenda, some parts of his agenda. We actually disagree on quite a number of issues, I think, but not when it comes to election integrity, which I don't really see as a Republican versus Democrat issue or a left versus right. This is right versus wrong. This is integrity versus corruption. This is transparency versus secrecy. And what Clint Curtis has suggested is have an initial count by electronic voting machines for an unofficial tally so that people get an idea right away, but then follow it up with a hand counting of paper ballots. And if it takes a day or two, doesn't much matter, but just the same rationale of Columbia County in New York under Virginia Martin, that if you're following it up with a hand count, there's no incentive to rig the machines. And under Clint Curtis's proposal, the official count would be the hand count.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's good, but I wonder if you're going to hand count them anyway. I'm not quite sure why you do the electronic machine count.
Maybe
also,
to just placate the electronic voting machine company so they keep getting their contracts.
It's big
and
money.
the media.
Yeah.
Because the media is, chomping at the bit for something to report.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is that we have a very variegated voting system throughout the country. And there are a lot of people who want to make it, to centralize it and make it uniform. I personally, I've worked in IT for decades. I would not do that. Decentralization it's better that it's decentralized. If there's any kind of machines, things like that involved, you want as many people, you want there to be so many bribes that you have to do and so many things that you have that it becomes just very difficult to rig a national election. As far as the crypto goes, yeah, I mean, crypto just basically produces an audit trail, right? That's what blockchain technology is about. It produces, like a transactional record, and it just strings them and chains them all together. So, but still, how many people could actually look at code, if they could even get access to the code? How many people could actually look at it and be able to tell that something was wrong? Not many. You want to maximize the number of people who can recognize with their own knowledge in their own eyes that something is wrong. So
yeah, I agree, which is why I've always been skeptical of even open source software. You mentioned earlier that you might not vote. I've thought about not voting this time as well. I have no confidence that when my paper ballot is scanned here in Broward County, that it will be tabulated properly. I've been told that if I don't check the box next to the candidates' names, but instead write in their names, that there's a better chance that it will be hand counted. So I've thought about doing that, voting, but just writing in who I want, even if they happen to be listed on the ballot.
Well, that's a good point. And we haven't even talked about the mail-in ballots yet. So, Kelley, you've gotten into, increasingly become an observer and a watcher and understanding how elections work. And Tim, you've actually run in these elections. So with all the things that you see happening with the 2020 election so far, and all these warnings and rules changing because of the pandemic, rules changing about the way we do vote, the way that we get ballots, the way that we count votes. What has set off your radar?
For myself, it has been on the Democratic side, this mantra that we need to vote by mail. And I saw this among the election integrity experts. So they had to accept a certain narrative about the COVID pandemic, which seemed increasingly unrealistic. People are going out in public to do their grocery shopping and to gas up. And there are a lot of things that are happening in public, whether they're wearing masks or not, that if it's safe enough to go out in public to buy your groceries, whether it's with a mask or not, then it should be safe enough to go and vote in person. I've been skeptical of the mail-in ballots from my own personal experience. The vote by mail here seemed to have favored the incumbent political machine, the Wasserman-Schultz machine, and I had heard this from the very beginning. We had trouble getting into the nursing homes, the assisted living homes, to just meet with voters, to just schedule something where I could introduce myself and meet with them. And Wasserman-Schultz didn't have that same problem. Is it just because she was an incumbent? We were told that her machine controlled a lot of these assisted living facilities, that they'd have people on the inside. And it was anecdotal, but I had folks who were willing to fill out affidavits and swear that there were people on the inside who were filling out ballots for residents, elderly residents who didn't even know that votes were being cast in their names. So I'm very skeptical of expanding that well beyond senior citizens who, maybe are too frail to show up at a voting site. As it is here in Florida, we've got 10 days of early voting where if it's not convenient on election day, you could come out over this 10-day period to one of a dozen early voting facilities in Broward County and cast your vote. So you really don't have to wait online very long. So I don't know what to expect in this election. I think if somebody says they know exactly how it's going to come down, they're either kidding themselves or BSing you.
Yeah.
It's going to be utter chaos. That's what I expect.
Well, but you're saying that, and lots of people are saying that, but how do you know that? I think that has been planted in your, deliberately planted, and I'm just wondering why. Well, how do you know? Just like at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm talking about like the first week that we decided that it was an emergency here and all that. We had Bill Kristol, and the tweet's probably still there. And he wasn't the only one, but they're saying nothing will ever be the same again. We're going to have a new normal. And we're like, dude, you don't know anything about all the doctors and they're saying, we don't know enough yet. We don't know enough yet. And these people are making these grand proclamations. I don't think that was genuine. I think that was, preparing your expectations, I don't quite know why. It could just be him being, a big bag of wind, which he is that too. But
a lot is playing out in the federal courts right now, and these cases are making their ways up to the U.S. Court of Appeals in the various circuits. And I know there was one big case that was just decided, I forget which state actually, it might have been Michigan or Wisconsin, where the appeals court at the federal level struck down the state's plan to accept vote-by-mail ballots for a 2-week period after November 3rd, which seemed ludicrous right there. That's asking for all kinds of political manipulations and trouble. And the Court of Appeal said, no, you can only accept ballots that are, I think, received by the election day. So, it's possible that come November 3rd, the cases, the federal courts will have weighed in enough that there might not be an avalanche of absentee ballots that will allow uncertainty to rule for weeks or months. I'm certainly hoping that there's enough clarity that on election night or soon afterwards, we'll know who won. But one never knows what the agenda is of powerful people who have a track record of rigging elections.
Yeah, I didn't mean, I kind of jumped on you there, Kelly, and I didn't mean
no.
it as a scold. I was trying to make an example
Right.
of you there, which I realized that may not have come out the way I intended.
Oh no, that's okay. I'm just expecting that, there's going to be it's going to be dragged through court. It all depends on how the election turns out. I mean, is it going to be, if it's close? I mean, I think we are going to be looking at people questioning the validity of it. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, there are some big issues. We already know that ballots have been mailed out and without requesting a ballot. We know that in apartment complexes, several generations of tenants the mail is arriving, for them. If you've ever rented a PO box for your business or something, that you get mail for like the last 4 people who had that PO box. But there's just all these ballots out there already. Seems like the damage is done, and I'm not quite sure how they got that through to send out ballots without requesting them, without being confident that your address list is good, which obviously it's not up to date.
It is a pathetic election system that the United States of America has.
Yeah, and I think there has been, and I don't watch much mainstream media. I don't have cable, but I just catch glimpses of it. There has been this narrative already. They're saying, Trump is not going to transition peacefully out of the White House. They are setting that up already. I believe that if he does win again, that, if he doesn't win, that he's going to not go peacefully. So it's just very biased. So, the strange thing to me is I remember when I first kind of got into this, I always heard that vote by mail, the states that had the vote by mail, that was the least secure. Yeah. And now it's okay. So it's just weird how it flips like that.
Exactly. It was the election integrity folks who saw that as really a no-brainer, that vote by mail was just not very secure and should be avoided. And now a lot of them are embracing it wholeheartedly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed there's the group verifiedvoting.org, I believe, and it was what I always went to when I would talk to candidates about what machines they had, but they've changed the whole website, and now it used to be it was like yellow to red of what was the worst, the DREs, but vote by mail was the worst. That was how they had it listed there. And that's changed now. So I don't know if that was intentional or what, but
it goes against everything I've always been about, to just reject an election. But from what I've watched, I always had some concerns, but 2016 really shook my confidence. By the time we got to the end of that primary, they stopped doing exit polls, which were the supposed gold standard. And, one of the only indicators of whether that the average person has of whether, if there was something funny about an election. And so instead of straightening things, by the end of the 2016 Democratic primary, if you remember, was it the California race that they actually called it before anyone actually voted?
Yeah,
that kind of thing, and quit and just shut down the exit polls.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And now I watch media companies and I've watched them degrade to the point where sometimes it's just almost 100% inaccurate from what I know of a subject, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And yet these same organizations are commissioning polls.
Yeah.
Right.
And we're supposed to believe that the people, oh, well, people will say to me, but they're just paying for the polls. The organizations who actually do the polls, integrity is like so important to them that, they won't, why would I even trust these polls? I mean, I don't know why I would.
wouldn't trust these polls at all. And people who are analyzing them are saying that there's a lot of bias in most of these polls, in oversampling of one party, for instance, to suggest, prepare people for certain results. There's a real problem in the media in this country. When 5 major corporate conglomerates now own 90% of the television broadcast, radio broadcasting, cable, news, and 90% of the print media. The concentration of ownership in just very few corporate hands is so intense. And they're, I would argue, much more committed towards their big profits and whatever corporate agenda, advertising revenue, big corporate interests, than they are at arriving at the truth. And surveys after surveys are showing that I believe now a majority of people in the industry, editors and journalists, report a lack of autonomy in their jobs. This is a top-down authoritarian media system. And that was the mass media. Now when you get to social media and the big tech giants, we're supposed to trust their censorship decisions. So this is not the American way. It's not what the First Amendment should be based on and was based on all these years.
Right. And those two issues, I mean, the integrity of our elections and the integrity of our media, the information that everyone gets, is so compromised. I mean, most people don't even recognize, I think, what real journalism is anymore.
That's right.
And you've got opinions peddled as facts. And unfortunately, I mean, you've got, well, the Russiagate stuff went on for 4 years, so everyone just accepts that as fact. So, yeah.
Well, and that's what, there should be a Justice Department that prosecutes real criminal activity instead of pushing certain narratives themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem, and I say this from my own personal experience, when a Justice Department would not investigate a clear case of ballot destruction, I don't think it's unique that I'm singled out in ways that others aren't. I think it's a Justice Department and an FBI that who knows what corporate agendas, what private agendas they're pushing. But it does seem that the rule of law has been for sale for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
One last thing about elections, the 2018 elections. I think I'm afraid that there's going to be sort of that on steroids. I had little confidence in what I saw happening. I was worried that the Democrats were running all these people who were ex-military and intelligence, and nobody was talking about it except a website that, whatever it is, the
World
WSWS
Socialist Journal, I think it was, right?
Yeah. When I looked at that, I thought, oh my, there were some right here, long time red districts suddenly flipped to blue, but the initial results of the elections in a lot of cases were very, very close, or the Republican may have won. And then like a day or two later, because either it was too close to call and whatever, but a day or two later flipped. And then suddenly the Democrats had a blue wave, which was easy to believe, frankly, with, backlash with a very controversial president like Trump, right? And one who sort of hadn't delivered on his promises. So it was plausible, very plausible. But there just was something that set off my radar. And then the 2020 primary, look how that kicked off.
Going into Super Tuesday, Bernie Sanders was ahead in a majority of those Super Tuesday states, and Bernie Sanders won most of those exit polls. And yet Joe Biden went from 3rd or 4th place in many of those states to win 10 out of 14 Super Tuesday states. Nothing to see there.
And what did Bernie do? Tell everyone to support
Well,
the neoliberal establishment Dem. I mean,
here
you
we
can't.
are. Here we are in October with some October surprises, right? That Hunter Biden and Joe Biden maybe were enmeshed in some kind of corruption in Ukraine and other countries. Well, you know, throughout the Democratic primary, there was already a video of Joe Biden boasting about getting a prosecutor fired in Ukraine. How many of the Democratic candidates raised it in the primary? Not a single one. You know, they've set themselves up for this disaster if this is what is happening.
Yeah, and they seem a-okay with the censorship. What's her name? McKinney, the White House press secretary, that her account was just shut down. Yes. I mean, to me, I don't care if it's the side that I agree with or not. When it comes to censorship, that is scary. And I don't understand why a lot of liberals, Democrats don't see that just because they're censoring the side you don't like right now. What does that mean for later? I mean, it just blows my mind that they're okay with that, you know. Yet we had years of Russiagate stuff that's now been debunked. CrowdStrike being one of that, you know, that they showed that it couldn't have been a hack, basically. Do they correct that? No. Do they shut down those accounts or MSNBC that peddled that? I mean, no, they don't. So that's what I think is so scary, is that so many just are not seeing what's happening with the censorship. Yeah.
You mean our partisan friends, right? The people who were all of us they were our political allies. Mm-hmm. And it puts us in a very uncomfortable situation, right, not to mention all the worst things, but.
Right, because the tribalism is so bad that you can't say anything anti-Democrat without immediately being called a MAGA or something. I mean, I've encountered that.
I've encountered it too, and it's a way to censor free thought.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. I mean, just because I can agree with 5 things someone on the right says, it doesn't mean I agree with everything that they say. But it's that independent thought. I think this is just a very strange era where we have, like, any independent thought is thwarted. Like, I mean, you're just, mobs will attack you. Social media, and you know, and now we're hip deep in the vote shaming that's going on. I'm encountering that myself. Here we go again. I don't care how much you tell me I'm privileged or whatever, you know, I'm in a swing state. So I always really get piled on for that I refuse to vote for Joe Biden.
You know, the Democrats never had a real kind of postmortem from any of their disasters.
No.
Prior to 2016, they had lost 1,000 legislative seats in the course of just 2 or 3 elections nationwide. And then they lose in 2016 to somebody who they thought would be a cakewalk to defeat in Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And instead of a postmortem to figure out what the problems are in the party and what needs to be repaired within the party, they really doubled down, and they pushed this overblown narrative that somehow Vladimir Putin had chosen our president. And, you know, as a result, it's still a very flawed party.
Yeah. And there are people that it blows my mind. They genuinely cannot understand how Trump could have won. So in their mind, it had to be Putin. It's got to be some other reason. I guess they don't know many white working class people that have felt, you know, put down for decades. You know, one study I quote often, which showed that 24%, nearly a quarter of Trump voters in 2016 were merely anti-establishment. They're not, you know, classic conservatives. They really weren't even for Trump. It was simply an anti-establishment vote, nearly a quarter of them. So,
which is why I think Bernie Sanders might have been the only one who could have defeated Donald Trump in 2016.
Right.
You know, Sanders had all that outsider energy. Mm-hmm. People were tired of a system that didn't work for them.
Right.
A financial collapse like none other in 2008, the biggest financial and economic collapse since the Great Depression. And you had a Democratic administration practice trickle-down monetary and fiscal policies, leaving tens of millions of people behind. with stagnant wages, stagnant jobs, lots of frustration, and people were willing to gravitate towards Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump, two perceived outsiders, two real outsiders, I think, in many ways. And the establishment doesn't want to acknowledge that, and will continue to double down to prevent any outsider from getting elected or staying in office.
And that's why they'll continue to push this tribalism, to push the division, because the greatest threat of all would be if those 24% of Trump voters in 2016 that were just anti-establishment teamed up with all the non-voters and the people, the Dem exiters. I mean, that's a landslide right there. And that's what they're most afraid of. They don't want those people to start connecting the dots that, hey, okay, maybe we don't agree on everything, but we can agree on 70% of things and work to find some solutions. And that's the biggest threat. Yep. So that's what I'm hoping to do. Keep working with more independent candidates. I think a strong coalition of independent candidates that refuse to sell out and are committed to representing the people is a win, because most people are sick of both parties. Yeah.
I think it's not really even quite anti-establishment. I think it's more of a, in its simplest form, populist movement, right, and anti-corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
Anti-corruption is very popular, right? I mean, it's a simple platform. Mm-hmm. Could find a lot of common ground, and I agree with you totally that is what terrifies. Because at the same time that the populists call it, I know that's a term that's been demonized and sort of twisted. I'm talking about just very basic. I'm not talking about nationalists or anything. Just, people who want representatives to actually represent them, more power for the people, if you will. Mm-hmm. So, if you could just get to that point and just stick to some broad issues, I think you can make a huge amount of progress. But here's the thing: at the same time that a populist movement has been rising on both left and right and in between, I don't even like to do this left-right thing. Let's just forget I even said that. But at the same time, the amount of wealth and power that has concentrated to such levels, almost unimaginable levels, and that's only the wealth that we know about. That doesn't even count the money that is in offshore havens and all of that. So, you can see why the people who now have that concentration of wealth and power are fearing an uprising, because one thing they don't have is the numbers. All right, well, if there's anything else, I hope we can continue this discussion either right after the election or, I don't know, even before, but.
And thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
If you could tell us where we can support you, where we can generally find your work, or, keep in touch with what you've been saying, and, sure, if you have any organizations or websites or anything we could support, just please let us know.
We have a nonprofit called Progress for All, which you can find at progressforall.org. I'm available on Twitter and on Facebook. Folks can find me there and contact me through those means.
Kelly, also, how can we find you online? How can we support you?
I'm on Twitter at Kelly's Words EY, and also check out candidateswithacontract.com. We'll have more to come with that in 2022 and 2024. I really believe that an independent movement is possible. We have huge hurdles, but I do believe it's possible. So that's where I'll be doing most of my work, but also check out Assange Countdown to Freedom.com. There are lots of great interviews there with lots of people you recognize, Afshin Ratanzi and John Pilger and Max Blumenthal, and they're great interviews, all speaking out in defense of Assange. And to anyone who isn't really a huge Assange supporter, I hope they will look further and understand it's not about the person, but this is about freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and the ability for us, the general public, to understand what our country does. I mean, the war crimes that were exposed in WikiLeaks are just what we wouldn't even know all of this stuff without them. So it's critically important that we support Assange. And I hosted a couple candidate panels, pro Assange, that Tim participated in. So I just want to thank Tim also for continuing to speak up and stick his neck out there. I know he gets a lot of hate for speaking the truth, and I think it's so important. Has always been kind of our most outspoken candidate with CWAC, and a lot of people really followed your lead. I think it's easier to speak out about things when you know you're not the only one. So it helps.
Well, thank you, Kelly. And I appreciate that you brought up Julian Assange. My thoughts and prayers are with Julian, and let's hope that this turns out well.
I hope so, yeah.
Somebody should not have had to suffer the way he's been suffering these years.
No.
For simply trying to publish the truth.
Yep, exactly.
Well, let's do this again, guys, especially now that I know Tim's teaching First Amendment and stuff. I'm itching to talk to you about that, I don't know, a whole bunch of different topics. Kelly, a friend, always love talking with you. So thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Tim Canova and Kelley Lane. Follow Tim on Twitter at Tim_Canova, CANOVA, and find his work at progressforall.org. Follow Kelley on Twitter at Kelley's Words, KELLEYSWORDS. This podcast is independent media. Listener support's really important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire or PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find the podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.